Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that has been recording about as much as Nadine Dorries has been speaking in Parliament. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Tom?
Yeah, not bad. People can become a patron to go listen to what we've been chatting about, but basically we've been catching up on life. We saw each other physically at a wedding recently, which was nice. But we have, because we've been doing lots of things in person, both together and apart, we have not had as much time to record. We're sorry about that, but we're back because instead of doing a summer special as we want to do, there's too much news yet again. So I guess we're going to go straight into the headlines and then big story. So yeah, it's a quick one on the intro today, but yeah, the headlines. So first up from The Independent, the Trump conspiracy. Which Trump conspiracy would that be, Rob? I think there's a few.
There are several, but it's news that basically Donald Trump is to be indicted about his alleged plot to overturn his election defeat in 2020. Essentially what happened January 6th, we recorded a big podcast about it. You would have been living under a rock if you hadn't noticed what was going on that day, as far-right protesters who supported Trump decided to storm the Capitol building, and it was, those images went across the world. They didn't exactly paint Trump or the Republican Party or anybody involved in it in a great light. And there's been a January 6th committee that's been building up to this. And the news has been released today. And Trump is, I think, as we are recording, about to go in and release his statement or to talk to the actual committee where he will be indicted for trying to whip up this furore about it. Even Mike Pence, his vice president at the time, yesterday spoke out about it, saying how, there was nothing Mike Pence could have done to overturn the election result. Donald Trump was the one who was pressuring him into doing so, and that put him in an impossible position. So, yeah, it's big news that a former president would have been indicted of anything. Since we've last recorded, we at least, I don't know if we touched on the allegations that Trump had of basically sexual indecency against one woman, which he won some accounts of and lost others. Now he's been indicted. I think this is his third indictment, because his second indictment is about taking papers that he shouldn't have from the White House and using them after, using classified documents when he wasn't president. This is all stuff that if it was any other political candidate would have left them dead in the water and nobody wants to support them. However, with Donald Trump, it's always a bit different, and it appears that his supporters are, his supporters don't like the system anyway. They do think that Trump is a man who rallies against the status quo. So the more the system wants to bring him down, the more they must be trying to hide him away from something. So, yeah, big news. And I do wonder if it is going to affect Trump and his election chances. Doesn't seem to be affecting his base support. However, my opinion is that his support amongst wider America, even if he does get the Republican nomination, probably the best thing for the Democrats, because I think it is very easy to say there's a man who has broken the law 3 times. Do you really want him to be your president? To the average American citizen, and they'll be less likely to want to vote for him come 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it when he was in office. He had this kind of solid base, but that wasn't enough to win him a second term. There's those swing voters in the middle, the average American, as you're saying, who will see this and go, I'm not sure. The people who fully believe in Trump no matter what are going to fully believe in Trump no matter what. That's what they do. Also, the other interesting thing I think is about the timing of these, because these are all coming out now, and I think all 3 of these, is it 3 cases, 3 indictments now?
Yeah,
3 all 3 of these, they've kind of said we want to make this a really fast case. But you don't mean cutting corners. I mean, we want to get through it before the elections happen, because you could be in a position where he goes to jail for one of these things if he's found guilty just before the election takes place. And then kind of interesting, I think they were saying on a podcast I was listening to the other day that he could be elected from jail. There's nothing stopping that in the US. But you would like to think that if your candidate is behind bars, the average person won't vote for them, even if the base does. So, yeah, I mean, if that were to happen before the election, that's probably going to be a negative to his campaign, I'd assume, regardless of the current level of, like I'm saying, I don't think the base is enough to win him the election. So if he was behind bars, that might be a kind of a done deal in favor of Joe Biden. Don't have anything else to say on that, I think, but it's one we'll be watching in the headlines, I guess, until it becomes our main story one week as it surfaces to, as we get results from one of those trials. Our next headline is from The Times. Banks told to respect free speech. Which is, you're going to fill us in on the details, but I think this is one of the stories I found the most, we've got a lot to catch up on. You explain to us, Rob, and then we can go into detail on it.
Yeah, if you've been wondering why right-wing man who looks like a frog, Nigel Farage, has been appearing on your front pages once again, it's because of this story. So obviously he was very famous, did a Brexit, went away, and then about a month ago now, I'd say the story bubbled around and came up on the BBC that Nigel Farage had been rejected by Coates, who are a bank that are a subset of NatWest, but they deal with high finance. And they said, we're not allowed him to have an account with our exclusive bank because he has fallen below the wealth threshold. You need at least £1 million. He hasn't got it. We've offered him an account at one of our regular NatWest banks. And everybody had a bit of a laugh and a chuckle that he wasn't as rich as he once was, a bit of fall from grace. However, Nigel Farage was out there saying, no, this is a political attack on me. They've stopped it because of my political views. And that was all poo-pooed. They said, no, we've done it just because of wealth. However, the more he fought it and the more it came out, it turned out that there was an element of it wasn't just about the wealth thing. It was about his political views. Some have argued that it might be about his alleged links to Russia. Of course, Nigel Farage denies this, but you have to remember that he was a presenter on Russia Today, the Russian state-owned media channel, and was involved heavily with them for a while. But, if those links still exist, nobody can say. However, because this story was proved false, the BBC not only had to issue an apology, but it has meant that the head of NatWest has resigned, the head of the fancy bank Coates has resigned as well. And it's put up a little bit of a debate, because no matter what your political views on Nigel Farage, it probably is important that banks don't take your political views into account when they decide to give you an account or not. Because if they could have a look at, if they had a look at your statement and said, oh my goodness, don't you donate to a lot of trade unions? I don't want you to have a bank account with us because I think you're entirely left-wing. That would upset a whole load of other people throughout the country. So the independence of the banks is an important issue. I just think that it's maybe a little unfortunate, or at least I didn't appreciate the fact that I had to look at Nigel Farage's face for about the 3 or 4 days that it was plastered all over newspapers.
And I think as well, another thing to touch on is that at no point was he denied a bank account, which was his whole thing he was trying to say and alleging in the news. And that's not true. He was he had a fancy bank account, and banks can refuse those. It's like going to the pub. You can be refused entry for any. No one can refuse you having a bank account, a standard one. But one of these fancy ones, like the one at Coates that he had, they have extra bells and whistles attached. And while those probably shouldn't be someone's political views, the original argument was, well, he just didn't have enough money to own this fancy bank account, which is quite standard. So I'm not saying, obviously some stuff was found out that made it they had this kind of file on him, and that was a bit dubious, but it also feels like, it wasn't as it was being painted necessarily in the media, that it's it's not freedom of speech, really. It's a fancy bank account can always choose not to give you a fancy bank account, especially if you're someone who might bring the bank into disrepute, is how it's seen. Now, it probably ended up that Coates did worse out of this whole debacle in the end because he made a fuss about it, and it seemed like the government sprung into action on this one and not on, things I would consider more important. Let's leave it at that, shall we? But yeah, I think that was kind of the conversation being had. A whistle stop thing that kind of happened while we were away. But yes, interesting, and it's slightly annoying to see Nigel Farage be proven slightly right at any point. On to our next headline from the Daily Mail. BBC crisis over top star in sex photos probe.
Yeah, this was another story that kind of dominated the headlines as one of the runaway news stories whilst we were away. So, and it brought up a couple of interesting issues around privacy, I thought, and what right you have in the media to privacy. So a story broke primarily in The Sun that some high-level BBC star had been accused of sharing lewd photos with somebody that was alleged to be underage, or it might not be appropriate for them to be sharing those photos. However, because of British law and British libel law, they couldn't name the star involved. However, they could post the story. So what this began was sort of days of blanket coverage from newspapers and from the BBC itself, saying, well, there's an investigation into this person, but we can't say who this person is. So, of course, that leads to speculation, word of mouth, stuff on social media, etc. And it brings up a really interesting premise of okay, when does this become such an issue of public interest that you have to reveal who it is, or do individuals always have a right to privacy? Now, going back to the story itself, it was revealed that it was BBC presenter Hugh Edwards who is involved, who is, I think, quite a big BBC star in the scheme of things. He commentated on the Queen's funeral, the coronation of the King. If you had somebody who was kind of the unofficial face of the BBC, it is him. However, the story that the Sun read was not as cut and dry as it first appeared. There was differing accounts. It appeared that the story had come from the person involved's parents, and the person involved actually had a much different account, and the lawyer said that the parents' account was wrong. It was murky and not cut and dry, and as a story, it has sort of faded away into the background as the Sun can't quite back up their claims. But I think it's telling that this star was finally outed, as it were, before it all went away. At the time as well, when we were talking about privacy laws that go on, I didn't know that we haven't had very good privacy laws in this country. We didn't have them for a long time, and it's only sort of in the recent past, I'm talking 1990s, 2000s, when things have come in. There was a high-profile case of an Allo star who I believe was in a car accident at the time, and he went to A&E, and the paparazzi followed him, and they took a load of pictures, and he took them to court, and the judge said, well, I'm very sorry, there's nothing in the law that prevents paparazzi going into this A&E ward and taking pictures of you and putting it in the newspaper. So now law has developed that protects people. You've sort of got a right to privacy over your health records. You've got sexual things, you are allowed to have privacy over those as well. These things have grown over time, so that's how that BBC star got protection for so long. But in the age of social media, it's always a question of how long you can keep these things private. So it's not just the story itself here I wanted to focus on, but also the sort of wider questions around it.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of kind of I don't think anyone I knew particularly, people were interested, you can see, even amongst our friends, there's the public interest, people are oh, who is it? And people were saying, oh, is it maybe Hugh Edwards? There are all these rumors, and I think the way we first found out that it might be Hugh Edwards, we were all so middle-aged Twitter has gone weird, not out, and when I say that, I mean, I'm weirdly aware that I'm rapidly approaching what most people consider middle age. Being a millennial, I've maybe pushed off that thought until 40, maybe that's middle age, right? But realistically, we're approaching what is normally considered middle age. But the kind of, when we say the middle age Twitter, we mean people slightly younger than our parents who have the internet, and we don't necessarily align with politically. We're going, oh my God, it's Hugh Edwards, and we're like, no, there's no proof of that, right? Not Hugh. And obviously, like you say, the front of the BBC, the person you say you get in when the Queen, when Hugh's got the black tie on, someone has died. That was the thing everyone knew. I think people are going to speculate whatever is weird, as you say, because I think you look at Private Eye and stuff like that, they've done all sorts of stuff over the years. It's on the one side that then we have all these things like these super injunctions, which are kind of almost immediately tell you there's a story. And I'm pretty certain there is at least one interview with Ian Hislop about that, saying when these first kind of came out for football stars, or they get a super injunction, we're well, now we know there's an actual story, so we can start getting info for the story, even though we can't say anything about it right now, because at some point, if something that is illegal has happened, someone will go to court, and then at that point it's public interest and people can know about it. But there's kind of it's this interesting kind of two-way house where it's if someone is injured and goes to hospital, I don't believe the press should be able to go in and put a camera in their face and be like, oh look, here's the injured person. That's definitely not okay. This is with a lot of things, it's where do you acceptably think the line is? how far does the needle go one way or the other? And there was definitely a period where there were all these super injunctions, and I think probably when we were kids, I would say, like, that was when I was aware of super injunctions kind of coming in, or maybe just when I was at uni. And I always remember that being like, oh, it's a bad thing. But also the media has had almost unprecedented access to people up until this point. So it's kind of like there is a two-way street there. I don't know if I actually know exactly where I fall between these two kind of extreme. And like, I'm not necessarily sure that we're at a bad extreme on what we have now. Let's just be clear. I just haven't had the time to think about it personally too much. But yeah, I mean, I think it's in a situation like this where it turns out that the person had done nothing illegal, then I would argue that it's a good thing that the name wasn't there. But then there was all this kind of media circus around, oh, well, who could it be? And the BBC kind of, like, people were like, well, why didn't the BBC not say anything? Well, I'm sure more people would have been annoyed at the BBC for not saying anything. Or they're keeping all the people who think the BBC is only an arm of the government, spreading propaganda, which it's not. But, sometimes the government leans on them and gives them, like, I'm not saying they're perfect, but like in this kind of trying to not be biased, they definitely make mistakes at the BBC. But like, if the BBC doesn't report on something happening at the BBC, that's worse. But then also, if it seems like all the news is the BBC talking about the BBC, that can seem a bit like I don't think I have to beep out the term circle jerk, and people know what I mean. but yeah, that's how it feels. So it's like, when, I also guess it depends how much you follow the news. I don't like read the BBC news pages anymore all the time. I kind of have filters in place so reasonable news stories get to me, and then I'll go read up on them. But if you're just following the news like I used to, and I know other people do, then you're like, oh, well, for 5 days I've been talking about this thing, and then kind of disappears. Yeah. That was a bit of a ramble, I'm afraid. I don't really know where I fall on this, but like, yeah, it shows interesting things about how our society currently works with the legality of all this. Yeah, I don't have anything else on that. I guess we should move on into our main story. So our main story, you might have been surprised we didn't record last week when this story would have been slightly more relevant, but don't worry, we're here because there was an actual election. In fact, there were 3 by-elections, and I think we're going to explain them one by one, right? And then kind of give a general conclusion about the 3. By-elections happen when someone steps down from being MP or is kicked out from being MP, and I guess Rob is going to explain to us now, in each of these cases, which one of those things happened and the exact specifics. But yes, I just wanted to say we would have recorded this last week. We couldn't for various reasons. So here we are. I don't think our analysis is going to be any lesser for being a week delayed. If anything, I think we probably have a bit more insight, especially into Uxbridge and South Ruislip, which we'll get to at the end. But yeah, first up, Selby and Ainsty.
Yes, so there were lots of reasons why these 3 by-elections were all coming in at this time, mostly as a fallout from, I think, like Tory sleaze or Tory infighting is kind of the 2 stories that we have going on here. So the first one, Selby and Ainsty, was the MP Nigel Adams was stepping down. You might not know him as one of the big names, but he was an ally of Boris Johnson, and it was expected that he would get an honour in Boris Johnson's resignation honours list. He didn't, so he resigned in protest, leaving Rishi Sunak with a tricky by-election to hold. Now, I say tricky. The problem is that in Selby and Ainsty, it should be a foregone conclusion. In 2019, let me just grab the results here. So in 2019, the Conservatives won by a majority of over 20,000 votes. Nigel Adams got 33,995 votes to Labour's 13,858. However, we saw under Boris Johnson that these big swings away from the Conservatives were possible. The Conservatives had lost incredibly safe seats when they were going through the various, like, there were 2 Tory sleaze scandals, the Nigel Patterson one and the guy who looked at tractors, but they weren't tractors, it was pornography in Parliament. Both of those ended up having to face by-elections and losing their seats as a result. It was the same case in Selby and Ainsty, where Labour had a massive swing of 21.4% to them. The Conservatives had a swing of 26% away from them, meaning that Labour have won that for the first time in donkey's years. I can't remember where it is exactly, but it represents the second largest swing to Labour in a by-election since 1945, which is crazy. So a little bit of analysis on why this result is so important for the Labour Party is that, one, they win a seat that they wouldn't have to win if they wanted to win the general election. So they've got all these red wall seats, all these seats that they would have lost in 2019 by a margin of like 2 or 3%. Those swing seats. Goodness, if they get swings of 20% across the country, they're going to sweep way more than they need to get to a majority. So that's really good news for Labour. For the Conservatives, it's incredibly bad, as you'd imagine. They've got more misery on their shoulders if they can't hold these. The one crumb of comfort they've got is that it's a by-election. Turnout is reduced. It might be the fact that more Conservative voters are staying at home because they don't know that the control of the country is on the line. It's only this local constituency. But it is a real worry for them if that they are capable of losing these type of seats. Not even when you had stuff like John Major's sleaze scandals back in 1994 were Conservatives losing seats that were this safe. And it points to me towards an idea that maybe amongst the general public there's a move towards more tactical voting, and that people are willing to put their vote behind the candidate who is most likely to vote out the Conservative one. If I have a look at the result of the Selby and Ainsty by-election, the third candidate there were the Greens, which had 1,838. Liberal Democrats came 6th there, behind the Reform UK candidate. So that's my suggestion. That's like, although there is no official Labour Lib Dem pact, if people were slightly inclined to vote for Liberal Democrats in that constituency, I think they may have lent their vote to the Labour candidate, and that was enough to get them over the line.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, but we're trying to draw conclusions from this and look forwards. We're going to do our usual poll analysis at the end as well, but these are some of the first proper tests in an actual, like we've had local elections. We've talked about them at length over the last 2 years. These are the first like real MP elections. I know there are by-elections tend to go against the incumbent government, even when they're doing pretty well. But it's still, it's a good kind of data point on that way towards the general election that hopefully gives us a proper idea of what's going on. I said it too many times, but yeah, like I think it's interesting because like you say, with the red wall kind of places, people weren't sure what would happen. Were they fully won over by Brexit? Well, it seems like no. Like they at least understand what's going wrong. Like there was this kind of, oh no, maybe new lines have been drawn, and we talked about that. What's the political makeup of the country now? But I think, there's also a tendency for people not to vote for an incumbent government after like 10, 13 years. The same thing happened under Thatcher, then Major, right? Like, the Conservatives were there for a long time, and eventually people decide we're going to have a different government anyway. So yeah, it is interesting, kind of the flip side, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit more when we're talking about some of the later entries on this list. But that, Tony Blair was this kind of breath of fresh air and all of this, New Labour, blah, 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 completely different. Whereas it seems like Keir Starmer's not anything new. It's just the Conservatives are really bad. So it's like that's how it's coming across in the polling. It's like, I don't think most people go, Keir Starmer is an amazing leader of the Labour Party. Most people go, well, he's definitely not a Conservative. So, yeah. Moving on, shall we get on to Somerton and Frome, which is near you?
It is, yes. And I'm so delighted that you've called it Frome and not Frome, which everybody who doesn't know how to pronounce the place calls it. And it's a big bugbear of anybody in the Southwest. So you win some respect points from me, sir.
It's okay. It's up there with my favourite British pronunciation, which is Gumpster, which I implore all American listeners to look up how that's spelt. But yeah, Frome, which I can actually, it turns out, get a direct train to from where I live. It doesn't run very often. It's like twice a day. But it's also the easiest journey to go see my mum, who also lives in your neck of the woods. Not exactly where you live. Just one thing you were saying. One thing I wanted to check. We talked a bit about boundaries. These are the old boundaries, right? The new boundaries only come into effect for the next general election.
That's correct. I think there might have to be some clarification on some of the boundaries. I know that we don't know if my MP, Jacob Rees-Mogg, I might be going out of his constituency and coming into this new one, actually, as it is. So because we are right on the boundary as I am. So yeah, there are new constituencies proposed. I don't think all of the votes have gone through yet, but these are all done on the same constituent boundaries that were in place back in the 2019 election.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to check about that because I knew they were changing, and also was aware how close you live that you might move into this constituency.
Yeah. So, this constituency, as we pointed out, is based in the southwest, and this was a traditional Conservative Liberal Democrat battleground. Before the Conservatives had it, they had a long stretch of Liberal Democrat rule that went all the way back to 2010, and then when we had the big Lib Dem wipeout in 2015 after the coalition, it's been solidly Conservative to that point. So it used to be very, very close as a Lib Dem Conservative marginal. So I was having a look at the old results here. In 2001, the Lib Dems won by 600 votes, less than 1,000 votes in 2005. And again, the margin in 2010 is only 1,500 votes. Then in 2015, when it goes Conservative, David Warburton wins it by over 20,000, and he was able to keep that gap of about 20 to 15,000 votes well into 2019. However, David Warburton himself, he was surrounded by some controversy a while back. Now, we are talking a while back, and this is under Boris Johnson's government when he had to become an independent and then resign from government. And it's only now that he's decided to resign his seat, which is why the by-election was coming across. He had some odd pictures taken of him with what looked like a banned substance on the side of on a baking tray that he had alleged to send to some people. He unfortunately had some mental health issues after that and went away and has now come back and said that he won't go back into politics, but it meant that this seat was up for grabs. And the Lib Dems kind of did what they do best traditionally, which is focus on like very local issues, make it so. This was an election I actually saw the literature for. They were big on saying like, look, you've been ignored by the Conservatives for too long. You voted them in, hoping that they would do something for you back in 2015, and they haven't delivered on any of their promises. We need somebody who stands up for our local area, not somebody who focuses on those national issues. And it appears to really work because the candidate Sarah Dyke was able to overturn that big 36,000 votes that David Warburton picked up in 2019 with a swing of 28.4% to her and a swing of 29.6% away from the Conservatives, winning that election by over 10,000 votes. So what this means for like the impact on the parties is not only do the Conservatives have to worry about Conservative Labour marginals, they've got this big worry that all the seats that went Conservative to them back in 2015, where they were really able to profit from the Lib Dems' failures in coalition government and all the support they lost, that support appears to be coming back to the Lib Dems. And if they can pick up those seats, particularly in the southwest, and there are a few in Scotland, and there's a couple in some more rural areas of the country, sort of that middle belt. That's where the Conservatives could lose a whole set of fresh seats. I think if you remember the other by-elections that happened under Boris Johnson, a lot of those big swings were not to Labour, they were to the Lib Dems. And Ed Davey did those sort of like smashing the blue wall, the Lib Dem cringe, all those favourite things we like to see, the bursting of a big Conservative bubble, all of that jazz. So, yeah, great result for the Lib Dems, means that they are very much a force to be reckoned with, and it means the Conservatives are now seem to be fighting a battle on both sides if they want to win the election. It's clear that support is draining away from them in both types of constituency, and that's where Rishi Sunak should be really, really worried.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, people I think especially people of our age will dismiss the Liberal Democrats because they came in 2010 when they had all this student support, and then there was all the stuff around the student loans. So people went, oh, we'll never vote Lib Dem again. But that's only like a very specific segment of the population who were burned in that way. probably the people who are switching to Liberal Democrats now, I mean, I'm sure there are a few of those people who went, actually, well, at least they're better than the Conservatives and they might win in this seat, which, tactical voting can always be a thing. But also, there has always been a bit of a back and forth between people who are kind of not fully, people who are fiscally conservative, and so they will go for the Lib Dems, who they see as more fiscally conservative, but not the Conservatives when they're in that kind of swing voter space, instead of going all the way to Labour, which might, to them, feel like a step too far. So you get these seats that were often Lib Dem, which I think will probably, quite a few of those will flip back to the Lib Dems. Again, we'll get onto our overall view of polling data, but the Lib Dems have a solid 11% at the moment, which they've had for a while. They dipped down, during Brexit and stuff to maybe 7%, but like they generally have this kind of 10%, and that does turn into enough votes to get a few seats. And so I wouldn't be surprised if at the next general election the Lib Dems take back some of these Conservative seats that Labour won't win. But, obviously for Labour, that's still good. Every seat that, the Conservatives lose is good for Labour, even if it goes to a Lib Dem. So, yeah.
And I think this might sound weird to say, but I think that the Lib Dems kind of benefit from the fact that they are back in the position where nobody thinks they are going to get into government or be a kingmaker in any way. So back in 2010, when you had that big surge of support for Nick Clegg, it was because people seemed to be fed up of Labour, who had been in power for a long time, but didn't want the Conservatives back in. So they wanted a genuine third option. And so they voted Lib Dem, and that was enough to get them quite a few seats, not as many as they hoped, but enough seats that they could get into power, albeit with a Conservative government. And of course, after that, we know it was only one election later where they lost all of that goodwill. Now, at about sort of like the last few elections, they've had people in charge where they're saying, yep, we can have a serious, we're the only people who are against Brexit, vote for us and we'll completely undo Brexit if you want to have us in charge. I don't think Ed Davey's going for that. I think Ed Davey is going, right, I've got to rebuild this party from the ground up. I need to get us to keep having 50, 60 seats in Parliament. That's how we have our voice, because those years in the wilderness, those time after 2015 where they were sort of like decimated to like 7 or 8, that was a really bad time for Liberal Democrat politics, and they probably don't want to run the risk of being potentially wiped out again. So it is, they've shown amazing resilience, I think, as a political party, and I'm really impressed with how they are clawing back those type of seats. And I do think in the next general election they will get a lot more.
Yeah, I agree. So let's move on to our final by-election, Uxbridge and South Ruislip, which is near-ish to me. Like, it's not super near, but it is like at least near enough that I know where those places are. You can get to set them on the tube. Yeah, I think maybe this one's a bit more interesting because, beforehand there was like a vote on the Britain Elects Discord for where did you think this was going to go? And I went, I think it's possible that all 3 of these go away from the Conservatives. It wasn't a vote of like exactly who they go to. It was like, are the Conservatives going to hold on to all 3 of these seats? And I was almost certain they weren't going to keep the first 2. But this one, I was like, it'll kind of be the icing on the cake. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to vote for all 3. I think there's a chance. But maybe you can tell me why we were slightly disappointed there.
Yeah, so this constituency was the former one of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and was left open because he resigned from being an MP after the result of the judgment of the Privileged Committee that may have left him facing a recall petition in his constituency, which would have led to a by-election where he would have had to stand. So instead of standing in that by-election, he chose to resign, and another candidate took his place. I think that is, so in the past, Boris Johnson had won this constituency and won it by about 7,000 votes. Not as big as the other wins that we've seen, but it does tend to be that it's a London constituency, one of the few that votes Conservative regularly. And it does tend to be that if you have somebody who is going to be a potential party leader or prime minister in your constituency, people vote for them. There's a reason they're leader of the party. They've got some charisma about them. People are quite proud that their local MP is the prime minister. So they tend to keep them in power. The result here, as you said, was a surprise on the night. Everybody was expecting this to go to Labour, but in the end, the Conservatives won it by a margin of under 600 votes. The Conservatives got 13,965 to Labour's 13,470. Now, if we compare that to previous results, the Conservatives last time got 25,000 votes, so they've still lost 12,000 votes along the way. Labour last time picked up 18,000 votes, so they'll be worried that they weren't able to retain that level of support this time round, because if they had, they would have won this constituency easily. What were the differences in this by-election? Well, one, I think it was really important that Boris Johnson didn't stand, because it didn't become a referendum on Boris Johnson. I think if it had, as it was sort of back in 2019, I remember there was sort of like a rush on Twitter, like in the last few hours of that election, where people said, Conservative people are worrying, Labour are really positive about the Uxbridge constituency. They think there's a chance. They think there's a chance that they could win it. Come on, let's really get the vote out. In the end, Boris Johnson won it easily, but it's one of those places where, goodness, if you were anti-Boris, it's like, wouldn't it be funny if he didn't, if he lost his own constituency? He's a polarising figure, right? So he gets the vote out, but he would also push a lot of people away. So I think the fact that this wasn't a referendum on Boris Johnson worked in the Conservatives' favour. The other thing they had was the issue of the ULEZ. Now, you live in and around London more than I do. I wonder if you could explain to our listeners what that entails.
So it's the ultra low emission zone. Fun. Now, this is one of those things where when I first started seeing signs for it, I got worried because I had a car at the time. I don't have a car anymore. But the whole point of the ULEZ system is a bit like the congestion charge. It's to try and reduce exhaust fumes and stuff like that in the centre of London. So the idea is if you charge people essentially a tax to drive into the centre of London, that will make them think twice about driving in. So and also it does generate money from like businesses and stuff that have to go in. So, you have in the centre, you have the congestion charging zone, which is just has applied for quite a while and everyone's kind of used to it. The ULEZ goes further out, but it's based on emissions. So it's more like don't drive your big, horrible lorry or your really, really, really old lead belching car lead cars are banned, right? You have to get special additives for them to make them work. But you know what I mean? Like that's what it's aimed at. The argument I saw, now this is one of those things where I've never owned a second-hand car because I didn't have a car when I was a kid. I would drive a parent's car. And then when I got round to, I didn't need a car at university. I went to a university where I could walk around. It was a campus uni, for example. I know a lot of people did have a car, and I understand why people would want one for the feeling of freedom. I just didn't need one at that point in my life. So I went straight to being someone who bought a brand new car when I suddenly needed to have a car because I had to drive for work. So I suddenly had the money coming in to cover it. So I have never had a car that would fail the ULEZ. Like, that was the thing. I was concerned. I was like, oh no, this thing's coming. And I looked up and it's like basically any modern car is fine. Obviously, the problem comes in when you have a car that you kept running for like 30 years or whatever. Now, part of the point of the ULEZ is to help eventually phase those out. And, an electric car obviously has zero emissions, so would be fine for the ULEZ. So there's this it's kind of hard because I don't know the specifics of the people making this argument. There's a lot of people, it was obviously put forward by the Conservative Party being like, oh, you can't expand the ULEZ, which is what Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan wants to do. They're like, you can't do that because, all these cars we own are going to, it's like, you're stealing money from us because there's this car I own, it's worth a few £1,000s or whatever. And it's like, I don't think I know anyone with a car that would fail it. I say that. I know one person who lives on the outskirts of London, but never would actually, like, what we worked out, their drive to work wouldn't go into the zone. And they have a very old car. Like, when I get in that car, I'm slightly worried that it won't make it to the destination. That's the level of old their car. They look after it very well, but it is a bit rickety at this point. I wouldn't own it myself. And I think, again, this is that kind of incentives thing. I understand some people are in a position where they can't buy a new car immediately. There's also been quite a lot of warning about this, which is meant to mitigate that. And also, how often do you need to drive your car like that far? Like, I'm maybe not the best person to talk about this because I've kind of almost become militantly anti the concept of individual car ownership since I stopped having a car because I feel like they're just too bad for the environment. That is a whole thing I don't want to get into on this podcast. It's a personal opinion of mine, and I'm sure people have disagreements with it. And I don't have kids. I'm in a privileged position. I work from home most of the time. There's lots of reasons why I can make that choice, and I understand that. So please don't get too angry in the comments on this one. But yeah, I think it's, like, in general, the ULEZ was probably going to happen. People are putting some legal things against it. Those have all been quashed, and it's now going ahead, I believe I saw the other day. So Sadiq Khan can move ahead. The final thing to mention about the ULEZ is that it isn't a Labour policy. They're just expanding it because he's current London mayor. It was originally brought in by another London mayor with a possibly familiar name. Would you be able to care to guess who that was, Rob?
Boris Johnson? Yeah, Boris Johnson. Yeah, sounds about right. Yeah, I mean, it was sort of semi-ridiculous, this, but it's a quirk of by-elections, isn't it? That they don't become, this was one where the Conservatives were able to almost sort of hijack it and say, this isn't about national issues, this is about a very local one. London is one of the few areas in the country that hasn't been run for a long time by the Conservatives. Sadiq Khan is in his second term, I think, and is seeking a third.
That sounds correct, but I can no longer vote for him, so I've kind of forgotten.
Yeah. Yes. So this is something where you could where the Conservatives could, kind of point to him with a degree of confidence and say, look, this can be a referendum against him in a way, or against this policy. And it was enough to squeak them over the line, or at least keep some people away and get them the result that they wanted. So, good result for Rishi Sunak in a sense that they didn't lose all three, as many people were widely suggesting. However, I think this is maybe long-term bad for the Conservative Party in a sense, because they seem to have taken the wrong lesson from it. So what I've been seeing in the newspapers quite a lot recently, and where Rishi Sunak seems to be taking this policy, he's gone, oh, people don't really like this green stuff very much, do they? And that's something that he's been hearing a lot from people on the right of his party for quite some time. It's kind of the Reform UK lot and UKIP were sort of banging on about you shouldn't take climate change so seriously. And now he's seen it's potentially a vote winner where everybody else lost. He's go, oh, well, I might adopt that policy. And there are a couple of rumblings about, we will cut down on green taxes. That's where we can cut some of our things to get Britain moving again, to get our economy moving. We don't want green taxes holding our economy back, is kind of the thread they're going with. However, personally, I think it's going to be a big vote loser for him in the swing seats where it matters. It's not, these eco issues clearly do matter to some on the right of the party, but I don't think they matter to enough people to swing those states. It's going to be a field day for the Lib Dems, because as you've said, those people who are fiscally conservative but sort of more socially liberal, I imagine those who live in the rural constituencies would much prefer a greener policy than one that isn't, so they're likely to go to the Lib Dems. Those in the red wall constituencies, it's not a dividing line like Brexit was. It's kind of a culture war issue, but it's not to the visceral degree that Brexit was back in 2019 or 2017. So that's not going to tip the needle either. I think that they've got the wrong end of the stick here. And if you have a look at the results in the other constituencies where you saw swings of up to 20%, this set of by-elections, spells very bad news for the Conservative Party, and Rishi Sunak won't be looking forward to the next election with any degree of enthusiasm, I think.
Yeah. I think it is an anomaly in this set of results, and we know why. So it's really I think, there's always an amount of bluster when by-elections happen, right? Where, the Conservatives are like, oh, well, we did better than we thought we were going to do in this situation. And you're like, yeah, fine. But list of caveats. And so they can get some talking points out of that now. But I think fundamentally, the ULEZ thing, they can only really play on once. I'm sure they could try it and be like, oh, ULEZ worked last time. But I'm not sure they could make a reasonable, we're going to repeal the ULEZ thing when all the legal challenges have failed, right? So I think they've played their card on that this time and probably won't work in the general election. Also, given how close it was and the turnout was lower, I wouldn't be surprised if you get more turnout, less of whom are Conservatives, at the general election. So a bit of a blip, but not a surprising one. And I guess a blip, why am I feeling so kind of confident in these kind of statements? I think that's because we're going to go to the polls soon. Before we do that, you have a few things you want to bring up as well. But I'm just saying we've got the polls coming, and that's where I'm getting this kind of general confidence Labour are going to win the general election from, as you may have realised from previous polls. You've put down a few other things. Maybe the first story to touch on is there was a fourth by-election that didn't happen yet? Question mark? What's going on there?
So yeah, in the constituency of Mid Bedfordshire, you have MP, star of Talk TV, appeared on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, Nadine Dorries, who resigned she resigned when she didn't get an honour, but then never formally put her papers in, and then kind of didn't unresign, but said she wouldn't resign until she got all the information about why she wasn't made a lord officially. So she hasn't resigned yet, but it's definitely on the cards. She promises she will. No take-backsies. However, that is clearly another big future headache for Rishi Sunak. She's another one of those MPs who has a margin of about 20,000, but it's not looking good for her in her constituency, whoever decides to take that seat up in her place. However, she is causing headaches as an MP for Rishi Sunak as we speak. The local town council, I think you shared with us yesterday, has officially put a letter out saying that she's not representing the people of Mid Bedfordshire as she should do. She hasn't held a surgery since last year. She hasn't spoken in the Commons since June 2022. You know, she's out and about. She's written a book about Boris Johnson called The Plot. She's appearing on her own Talk TV show, you know, which is the Piers Morgan channel, or that wing of Rupert Murdoch right-wing news stations out there. But she isn't doing any of the things that she should do as an MP, and that's undermining people's trust in, you know, what MPs can do. I think even Rishi Sunak came out yesterday and said that he felt that, Nadine Dorries wasn't living up to what they'd expect an MP to do. So, yeah, that's another big potential banana skin for the Conservatives there.
I just want to add on that point. We've said, she said she was going to resign. What, are people? She has a 20,000 point lead, 20,000 vote lead in that constituency, but blah 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 has happened since everything you've just summarised. I'm going to throw this in the show notes. There's an amazing letter sent by the local council to Nadine Dorries, basically saying, "Why are you still here?" in the nicest possible terms. But I'll just to give you a summary. It starts with RE action required, no representative for Mid Bedfordshire. So it's like it goes from there. Basically, yeah, one of the biggest town councils she represents saying, "Why are you still here?"
Yeah, and it's a very valid question, and it is one of the more. It's the kind of thing that only Nadine Dorries would do as well. Like most MPs would want to get out of there and leave with their head bowed. Not her in this case. We'll see how it works out for her. The other final headache that Rishi Sunak could be faced with is in the constituency of Tamworth, which is that of Chris Pincher, which again, if that name is familiar to you, that's the man who is sort of responsible for bringing down the Boris Johnson government. He was the man who Boris Johnson allegedly proclaimed was Pincher by name, Pincher by nature, where there was a whole load of allegations against him of sexual impropriety. That was investigated by the Privilege Committee of all people, and they basically said that, they've said that he shouldn't stand as an MP anymore because of those results, so it's very likely that he will be forced to have another by-election in that constituency. And again, it brings up, we talked about how earlier there were those Boris Johnson ones that they lost under his government because of sleaze. This is sort of like the final Boris Johnson legacy sleaze scandal MP there, where the Conservatives could lose another. So, yeah, if they lose if they lose 4 out of those 5 possible by-elections, they're not going to lose their majority anytime soon. But it does show a clear ebbing away of support for them. And when you get swings of that much so consistently with every single by-election, again, as we said, we're going to look at the polls, but it doesn't spell very news for Rishi Sunak, the incumbent.
It's interesting. We probably don't have as much time as we'd like to discuss, but maybe that can be the next episode, depending where we get to, like talking about we've kind of generally touched on where are the Conservatives going now. Like they're kind of clinging to power. I mean, I say clinging to power, like they're not going to suddenly fall out of power before the general election. They're going to take it up to the line. I think that's pretty clear. But the kind of messaging coming out of the Conservative Party now is almost fully, it's like, it's not full on attack ads. We don't quite have that in the same way, but it's all just stuff that feels barely legal to say on Twitter. Where they're like, oh, we're doing this, and Labour, like saying like Labour, I think, were they saying like trade unions are like Labour's military wing or something, or just stop oil, like, saying stuff that is like provably false and should not be said, I feel. But yes, we're definitely at that kind of point where it's just kind of, I think it's going to be a lot of mudslinging from the Conservatives, probably to not much avail, because people are fed up with them. So at this point, whatever they says gets kind of ignored. We should move on into the polls. So let's have a look at our poll of polls first. I think that's how we normally do this. So essentially, it's not really moved much. I mean, we're technically down from February for Labour, but like there was this kind of bit in like just before we had the local elections in May where things tightened a tiny bit. So Labour was down a bit and Conservatives up a tiny bit, but not enough to recover, really. Like essentially things have stayed fairly flat since just after Liz Truss. So, basically when Rishi Sunak came in, it stabilised things a bit for the Conservatives. And then since then, it's not really got much better. Maybe a few people have gone his way. The current standings as of today, Labour 46%, Conservatives 26%, Lib Dems 11%, Reform on 6%, which is ahead of the Greens, but again, it kind of, because of where Reform end up, that's probably not really going to lead to them getting any seats, whereas the Greens normally get at least one seat in Brighton and Hove. So 20% lead for Labour still on average. So and as I said, it's been a slight upwards trend for Labour recently and a slight downwards trend for Conservatives. So not a good place to be if you're the Conservative Party.
Certainly not. And it kind of, there was a theme running. I haven't really touched it in the by-elections, which I'm sorry about. So like Labour, there's clear, like, we seem to be heading towards a Labour government, right? But as you pointed out before, whereas Tony Blair, at least in our minds and the history books, is kind of proclaimed as like there was some sort of like big thrust of enthusiasm behind him, there doesn't seem to be the same buzz around Keir Starmer. It seems inevitable, but just because he's the default choice, rather than there being sort of like masses of people saying, yes, he's our man. Now, my suspicion is if there was a general election campaign, you'd see that enthusiasm. You saw it there was a similar vibe around Ed Miliband where people weren't sure about him, and then suddenly there was that big push in 2015 where for a moment people tried to make him look more electable. I think you will see that. The Keir Starmer has a problem that he's been in opposition for what feels like a long time. It's not actually that long, but because he was in opposition through COVID and he's seen off 3 prime ministers, it feels like he's been there for 10 years, which doesn't help him at all. And those 3 Conservative prime ministers have been very good at telling him that he hasn't done anything, where Keir Starmer should probably remind them that he hasn't had any power to do much at all. But that 20-point lead is good for Labour. I don't know if you had a look at like individual leaders where they fall on the popularity scale. Maybe we should do that next time to mix it up a little. But I don't know if Keir Starmer is on a general upward trend when it comes to his personal ratings.
Maybe as an idea, and feel free to tell me like no, and I'll cut this out as a suggestion. But perhaps as a kind of quasi silly season episode, hopefully no major news happens that derails us, we could do like a comparison between now and 1996, and do like that there must be some historical data. Maybe the polling data is less good nearly 30 years ago, but we can do a comparison and be like, we're drawing these parallels because it seems kind of obvious a similar kind of thing is happening, Conservatives in turmoil, all of this. And maybe we can kind of do a deeper dive into that with your politics knowledge.
Yeah, I'd happily do that. I think a deep dive into like the world in 1996 and what went on is very interesting, because I know off the top of my head, like people put a lot of stake in New Labour and Tony Blair, and it certainly made them more electable. But other people say things about the economy and everything, and how the Conservatives have ruined the economy back in 1994. The economy was actually pretty fixed by 96, 97, or at least it was on an upward trajectory. The Conservatives had stopped the rot, but that wasn't enough to stop them losing the election, because of the perception that people had drawn about the Conservative Party. And if we go back to the problem the Conservative Party have, like I've said, the problem with Labour is that, Keir Starmer isn't Tony Blair and there's not much enthusiasm. The problems with the Conservatives is that you get the perception that they've ruined the economy under the leadership of Liz Truss. There's an awful lot of infighting. There's clearly still a Boris clique and a Rishi clique that aren't working together. Some seem to be actively working against them. If you have a look, I know Nadine Dorries is out the door and was one of Boris Johnson's most loyal supporters, but she's determined not to make things easy for the incumbent Prime Minister. The kind of good faith that there was in the Conservative Party, or this willingness to pull together for the sake of Brexit or COVID or any bigger cause, appears to be fading. And with it, the enthusiasm from their core supporters goes, and that's when you have a look at them and they don't turn out, or they shrug their shoulders with a sense of inevitability that, the next election probably is going to Labour. There's not much I can do. And once you're in that mindset as a party, it's so hard to turn the ship around. And Rishi Sunak has done nothing, in my opinion, to try and do it. He doesn't seem to have any ace up his sleeve, and it might be just totally irredeemable now. Whoever took on that gauntlet after Boris Johnson, and then certainly after what Liz Truss was kind of the icing on the cake of how badly can you run a country for 2 months and really ruin everybody's trust in it. That was kind of the thing that doomed the Conservative Party since that day. So not, as I've been saying throughout this podcast and for a few weeks now, not good news for them. But this raw data that we have, people going to the polls, it super confirms that for me now, that they are facing a big uphill battle come the next general election.
Yeah. And just to add in, we have our general election prediction from Electoral Calculus that they do once a month or once every 2 weeks. That's about a week ago they did that. So that's currently predicting the predicted seats for based on the current percentages would be Labour on 463, which is a majority of 276 over the predicted 116 for the Conservatives. And they're predicting 22 seats to Lib Dems, which is double what they currently have. So is kind of pulling into what we'd already said about the Lib Dems. Predicting 1 seat for the Greens, which will be Brighton and Hove, and then predicting 0 seats for Reform, despite them having a higher percentage. And again, that'll be because Reform tend to pull away from the Conservatives in areas, but it's not like all those votes are in one constituency, so it's probably unlikely to land them a seat. I mean, it still could, it's still possible. It does say that their high seats prediction would be 1, but I think it's unlikely on the current percentages that Reform are going to get anyone in. Looks very well. Labour majority 96% chance, and a Labour minority 33% chance, which gives us the probability Labour's the biggest party of 99%. And as far as political predictions go, that's pretty solid.
It's not 52 and 48%.
No,
it's not those terrible predictions of old where you just really could flip a coin and didn't know which way it was going to go. So yeah.
I guess that's it for another episode. Hopefully we can get back together sooner rather than later this time. My summer's actually fairly free, but I know that you've been doing a lot of cricket and stuff, so we'll see what happens. For anyone who wants to engage with the podcast, feel free to come along to parliamentary.observer, the website domain. I'm still surprised I'm allowed to own, and find our episodes where you can comment underneath them. You can, if you want to support the podcast and other podcasts on the network, we have to buy microphones and things and pay for Adobe Creative Cloud subscriptions to do the editing. Feel free to go down to patreon.com/TTSS. And there is a Patreon. Just for that $1 a month, you will get access to bonus episodes that we record before the podcast, where we just kind of talk about life, what we've been doing, talk about Lego and tiny soldiers that I paint and collect, and other things. Sometimes it's video games. A big video game came out today. Maybe we'll talk about that next time if that's Rob's thing. We'll see. And you can also find us all over the place. You can find us on, I'm still going to call it Twitter, despite its rename. But you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/Unparliamentary. Again, there's lots of things going on with various social media websites. So maybe I should make some new accounts and stuff going forwards. Maybe I should get some Mastodon account, etc. I will make that happen at some point, I'm sure, once we work out which way the social media cookie is going to crumble. But yeah, other than that, there's nothing left for me to say other than it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from him. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Get Threads. The people are crying out for Threads.
Threads is just Instagram with less videos. Bye.
Bye.
Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.